Hello everyone! Thanks for joining me today on this episode of Taking It From the Top, where we'll be addressing the topic of practice habits. Whether you're a performer, a teacher, a music scholar, or quite frankly, a human being trying to do anything at all, we're going to be allocating time to practice the skills necessary to perform well at a given craft, regardless of what it looks like. Performing musicians have this tendency and stereotype to lock themselves in a practice room for hours on end. And while I don't think that there are necessarily shortcuts to developing these musical skills, I often wondered in myself if there are ways that I could practice more effectively so I wouldn't have to miss out on my friends' concerts, so that I could explore the city I was living in, or quite frankly, garnering life experiences that would eventually feed itself into my own music making. Our guest artist today, Dr. Robert Leung, has talked and presented on this topic very extensively. Let's see what he has to say about building smart practice habits. My name is Jeffrey Leung, and I'm really excited to be joined by our first guest ever, Dr. Robert Leung, who is the Associate Professor of Saxophone at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. Woo, that's a mouthful. How are you doing, Dr. Leung?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to sharing some information and doing well.
Just for our viewers out there, I just wanted to see if we could get some insight on how you break down the way that you make decisions as you practice. And I guess the first question I wanted to ask you is, where are you on the balance of quality versus quantity of practice? That always seems to be the big question that a lot of students are asking.
It's both. Like you can't, like, I think they both have to exist. There's studies out there that kind of show that putting in the sheer hours, you're going to get better because you're doing it a lot. But you're only going to get to a certain point, and then you're not going to see much growth after that point. And I hit that point, earlier on in my career. I wasn't necessarily the most efficient practicer. So putting in the quantity, putting in sheer hours is a must. It's definitely necessary. But if it's void of high quality, you'll grow to a certain point, then one might find themselves starting to plateau. But on the flip side of it, if we shoot for quality with the absence of quantity, that's not necessarily a great thing either. If I practice 15 minutes every single day, but it's very, 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 very efficient, that's great. But at the same time, there's only so much that I can do in 15 minutes, right? So we need both. But if I had to weigh them, I put quality outweighing the quantity, because I'm not always able to practice hours and hours a day. So when I only have an hour and a half or an hour on the saxophone, I really have to make sure that the quality is there. So I don't think it's an either or discussion. I think it's a both and, but I think priority always should be on quality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I really love that you mentioned that the two of them have their own function in our practice regimen, in that, like, as efficient as you practice, there's no shortcuts to developing the musculature, to really gaining experience with interacting and interfacing with the instrument. But at the same time, when we are working with the instrument, we do need to be optimizing our time so that at the end of the day, we can experience life, for example.
Absolutely.
One thing that I really appreciate about the way that you talk about practicing in your materials and when you do this kind of talk with others is you talk about a particular method of goal-oriented practice following this like SMART acronym. Would you be able to speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So SMART goals, I think it sort of started to rear its head up a little bit um, in the 80s, in the early 80s. SMART goals is an acronym, and it stands for specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time bound. So for instance, if I said that I wanted to by the end of the year, I want to be a better saxophone player. That is a very vague, vague
Right.
goal. So there's nothing specific about it. How do you measure that? Um, um, of course, it's attainable, and I'm sure it's realistic. And it is time bound. You're telling yourself by the end of the year. But I think in that instance that example that I just gave, it's missing the mark of being specific and measured. So, um, I think like that. I think broadly like that. I want to improve on the instrument, but then I have to sort of break it down and say, okay, do what areas am I looking to improve? The thing about SMART goals, what I struggle with in music is some things with music can't fit into a pretty little rubric, right? So if we talk about sound, um, you know, that can get a little bit tricky to how do you measure that? So it just has to be maybe personal to me. Like I know what I'm looking for in my sound, and that's what I'm chasing after. So in essence, and I'm not saying every single goal that I have, I really try to go through every single one of these points, but a good chunk of them, I'm really trying to be as specific as I can, realistic, measurable, and every single one of my goals, I want to say that I put a time limit on it. And I want to add that having a goal doesn't mean that it's going to happen. I don't think that's not biggest my biggest motivation. I want it to happen at the core of my being. But the biggest motivation to me is that even if it doesn't happen, I'm going to be in a better place, have shot for that big goal. I'm under the belief that you begin with the end in mind, and then you sort of try to figure out how you're going to get there.
Yeah, I certainly love that approach in that this seems like it becomes a more. Meanwhile, you have these like short-term SMART goals of your individual practice sessions, but you're also keeping this eye on the prize, so to say that like of course at the end of the day, I think it's a very noble, very ambitious goal to be a better saxophone player by the end of the year. But I think your approach on okay, we want to get to that point, but what does that entail? And the SMART goals, I think, allow us to hold ourselves to be much more accountable to this because it's one thing for your saxophone teacher to tell you to practice your thirds, practice your scales, practice your rep, but ultimately you're the one putting in the work, whether you balance that quality versus that quantity. That's on you. Your teacher can recommend as much as you want, but I think holding yourself accountable to these SMART goals allows us to then make very tangible steps to that long-term goal. Right. Another question for you then, I guess, is with these SMART goals, I think when you and I have talked about it, a lot of it is sort of like, in this practice session, I'm going to accomplish this. Do you apply then SMART goals to like longer term trajectories, like when you're thinking about like your 1, 2, 5, and 10-year plan? Do the SMART concepts still apply in that context?
Yeah, that's a good question. So absolutely, I for myself and something I teach to my students, you never pick up the saxophone if you don't know what you're trying to accomplish in the practice room. So those short-term daily goals, definitely I apply those. But long-term, I think in the long term, that's those are more reason for me to apply these goals because I can only speak for myself. If I give myself a if I give myself a goal that's not necessarily very specific and I'm not holding my feet to the fire, and holding myself accountable for those things, I might start hot right away, and then after a year, life might happen, or I might have another interest, or I might have this, or I might have that. Yeah, I have 1, 2, 3, 5-year goals, and I really try to make sure that I, I especially those long-term goals that I make them smart. Angela Duckworth, who wrote a book called Grit. I was listening to her speak on a podcast, and she was talking about the idea of high level, mid-level, and low-level goals. So like kind of the low-level goals are your day-to-day tasks, you know, in the music world, you know, I have to practice for my lesson today, or I have XXXX, you know, pieces to work on. And the high level goals are essentially everything that you're trying to accomplish. So like my high level goal could be about how influential I want to be in my teaching or my playing. Like it could be, I mean, that's not necessarily a smart goal. You know, I would detail it out so that it is very specific, but my high level goal can be that big. And then everything under that should point to that high level goal. So that gives my day-to-day low level goals a function, you know? So I'm practicing today because I have to, because my teacher expects me to. I want to get better. But I'm also practicing because I have this big thing that I'm shooting for. And if I don't play, that's another tick in the bucket of me not climbing the ladder to where I hope to be. So I think having high level, mid level, and low level goals, especially on the long term, gives your day-to-day tasks function.
Right, and I love the way that you frame this in that like these SMART goals then both serve you both locally on a short term, but also serve this longer trajectory of what you want to be doing with your career or where you see yourself in school or whatever. And then I think in a way also reinforces this process driven approach, growth mindset, if you may, where you said like maybe if you faltered for a day and didn't quite make these SMART goals, it's still like you're making progress forward with this longer term goal. So in this way, I love the way that you talked about Duckworth's low, mid, and high levels of practice. I mean, in a way, from our day-to-day lives, you can practice practicing, right? In certain ways.
Exactly.
And that is super helpful, just because like there are so many things that you can be doing to be productive without having to spend time on the instrument, I guess, in certain ways.
And that's practicing too.
Yeah. So, like, maybe we could dive into that really briefly. Like, what are some ways that you find are helpful to practice without actually needing to be at the horn so you can optimize your time?
I have books that I read that give me ammo in the practice room. And all of my mentors, my teachers in the past, I watch them. I listen to them. Even if they're not teaching me how to practice like directly, I'm watching them and I'm getting information and I go to the practice room. I remember one of my first college teaching jobs, I was telling one of my students that when I was at University of Michigan and I would start practicing in the morning, I remember walking down the halls and hearing this cellist practicing every single morning in the same room every single morning. And she was warming up by the time I usually get there, and she was going through the same warm-up routine. And it seemed like something basic on the cello, but I just had the mindset that that sounds like it would be very challenging on the saxophone. Let me try to go to the practice room and do that, you know? So I think that getting information from everybody around you is super important, even if you know, they're not sitting down with you and talking to you about practicing. What can you pull from other people, other sources? And I think that's so important, because what we do in the practice room is essentially, you go in there with a tool bag, you know, you have your hammer, you have your nails, you have your all the tools in your tool bag. And when you're faced with a problem, you say, okay, I'm going to use the hammer and this. And if that doesn't work, you have to figure out how to, combine everything that you've learned over the years to tackle that problem. So practicing is so much about being creative and flexible. And if you do it the same way every single time, and you have the same mental approach every single time you get into the room, we might not see the improvement as quickly as we would like to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that you talk about equipping yourself with a toolkit every time you enter the practice room, and that the practice, that the act of practicing itself can be creative, and if you take a flexible approach to it, and it doesn't just have to be running your scales with a metronome all the time, but there are different ways to approach the same problem in a number of ways. That's fantastic. And I love that you also said that you drew from all these sources of inspiration, whether it was from reading, things that are outside of music, from past mentors, current mentors, or from different instrumentalists, right?
Right.
I think some of the great artists that we look up to when they talk about music, it's not just like, well, today on the saxophone, I practice my A majors and thirds, right? They're talking about experiencing life, listening to the great masters of their crafts, whether it's in music or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can just jump in really quick, like when you're, I think that, like you were talking about scales, I mean, nobody would disagree that scales are important, right? But if we practice scales just for the sake of practicing scales, then all we're doing is we're getting good at our A major scale. So I think that everything we do has a function to it and a reason why we're practicing it. I talk a lot about, voicing exercises. I work on overtones and voicing, control exercises all the time, as I know you do as well. But voicing exercises, these overtones, they're not monkey tricks. They're not magic tricks. Like, there's a reason why we're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And if I know that reason, then and I know why I'm practicing my overtones, then that actually frees me up to say, okay, what are some other ways so let's say the reason I'm practicing overtones is to have a better control over the instrument. So I'm practicing these overtones. That frees me up to say, okay, what are some other things I can do to control the instrument better? So you're thinking about, again, maybe we can say this is a high level goal to control the instrument. And the task is playing your overtones. What are some other tasks that you can do that would point to control over the instrument? There always has to be a reason and a function behind everything that we do. So I think that's the core of what efficient practicing is nothing is done in a vacuum. Nothing is done just to do it.
Right, and certainly this context approach or building context around your practice certainly is helpful in sort of addressing these very core skills that in and of themselves can seem very mundane or boring. But I think, like you said, if you can apply them to this more global context, it's certainly very helpful in driving our motivations and inspiring practice to be something that we derive pleasure from, and not just go through the motions for the sake of going through the motions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Would you be able to share any resources that students could go to if they wanted to step up their practice game?
Absolutely. So first, I'll just sort of reiterate, keep your ears open, keep your eyes open, and learn from everybody around you, as we were kind of talking about before. But there are a few books that I would point to that help my mindset in the practice room, and even outside of the practice room for that matter. So I think a lot about habits and how to maximize on them, and how to change them, and how to improve upon them. And Charles Duhigg wrote this book called The Power of Habit, that I highly would recommend. And also James Clear wrote a book called Atomic Habits. Those are both really good books, and they both, I would say, transform my life being productive. And another book that I hold in high esteem is a book that Anders Ericsson wrote called Peak. And Anders Ericsson is, deemed to be the leading scholar on deliberate practice. So the 10,000 hour rule that a lot of people have heard from Malcolm Gladwell's writing, the 10,000 hour rule was Anders Ericsson's long-term project.
A lot of the books that I have in my own collection were derived from your recommendations on Facebook and Instagram. So I would recommend for everybody out there, if you're not already following him, follow Dr. Robert Leung on all the social media platforms that I'll link to in the description below. But certainly, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Leung. But before we go, I was wondering if we could spend some time to talk about the Gio Project, something that's coming up quite quickly, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Gio Project is a personal journey and initiative that I started putting together, almost 6 months ago, maybe a little bit longer. So it derived from my wife and I. We had twins. One was born with a congenital heart defect, a defect in the formation of his heart. And at the age of 8 months, we unfortunately lost him on Mother's Day, 2020. And I started thinking about ways to memorialize his life. And, I'm a musician, and that's the best way I know how to do things sometimes. So I'm putting together this virtual recital on February 12th, which is the tail end of Congenital Heart Defect Awareness Week. And it will be a recital that raises awareness of Hypoplastic Left Heart Syndrome, which is the defect that my son had, raising awareness of that defect through music. And of course, there'll be some beautiful music on the program, but also I have interviews on there from some medical professionals about the congenital heart defects. Also, my wife and I will be sharing our journey, and all the money that is donated during that recital is going to go to an organization called Mended Little Hearts, which raises awareness for children and advocates for children that are going through those kind of challenging moments in their life. So it's a very sentimental project, but also there's a great mission behind it. So if you want to learn more about that, you can visit robertyoungsaxophone.com/Gio, Gio. Gio is the name of my son. And you can find out more information there.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. And thank you so much for sharing this story. It's certainly really inspiring to see artists that really find ways that use their craft to transcend the boundaries of just the concert hall, but really finding meaningful ways to apply our craft to affect the world around us. So for everyone that's watching and tuning in, please join me in attending this recital and making a contribution to the Gio Project. I'm really looking forward to this. And again, Dr. Leung, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Have a great rest of your weekend.
Likewise. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Sweet. Thanks again for checking out Taking It From the Top. I hope you found this conversation helpful. If you enjoyed this segment, make sure you like, subscribe, and share this material with anybody that you think will find it helpful. Tune in next week as we talk about air concepts, and hopefully it won't blow you away.